Today I'll be going over the most common mistakes you'll want to avoid here in France. France is one of my all-time favorite countries, and it just happens to be the most visited country in the world, so I know I'm not alone in that. French culture is incredible and diverse, and what you can see, eat, and experience here is unparalleled. But there are a number of common tourist mistakes that visitors to France make all the time. I mean, these mistakes are so common that I'll bet someone's made one of them since you started watching this video. And if you don't know about these mistakes, La Vie en Rose can quickly come toppling down and become an expensive and disappointing vacation. But simply by watching this video, you'll be prepared to avoid any faux pas when in France. I mean, seriously, these mistakes are super easy to make if you don't know about them. And the first mistake that folks make all the time in France is showing up to France without having properly planned in advance. I am not telling you to plan every single activity of your day before arriving, but it's important to book stuff like hotels, long-distance trains, museum tickets, and even make reservations for more popular restaurants before coming. If you don't plan ahead, you'll often get stuck paying super high prices for things. And it could even mean that you just don't get the chance to eat at your dream restaurant or visit the Louvre. I mean, being the most visited country in the world, there's a whole lot of demand for everything that you'll want to see and do when you're here in France. And missing out on anything just because you didn't plan ahead would be a total bummer. Yet it happens to visitors every day, so plan ahead. I mean, I've been able to stay at many nice places around France for under $100 a night, have had the chance to visit many of the world-famous museums and sites around the country, and have even been lucky enough to dine at some of the best restaurants in the world here. But I was able to do all of those things simply because I planned ahead. And once you're in France, don't forget that French eating times might be a little different than what you're used to. Dining in France is something you must experience. Breakfast is usually first thing in the morning around 7 or 8 a.m., and then lunch is usually around noon, and dinner will most often start around 8 p.m. But eating times can vary a little bit depending on the season that you're visiting in and the part of France that you're in. But still, if you keep the rough times that I mentioned in mind, you'll definitely find cafes, restaurants, and bakeries open. Additionally, during mid to late afternoon, it can be hard to find any place open outside of the grocery store. So if you're not used to having a huge break between lunch and dinner, it can be a good idea to have a snack or two on hand. There are a few other things to keep in mind regarding time when in France, but I'll go over those a little bit later in this video. So do make sure to keep watching and hit that like button if you haven't yet. But there's yet another common mistake that folks make a lot when visiting France. Do not assume that all of France is Paris and that there's no need to visit any other part of France. This kind of assumption is sadly quite ingrained in a lot of folks' perception of what France is. This is like assuming that all of the United States is exactly like New York City, or all of Australia is exactly like Sydney. Don't get me wrong, Paris is a great place to visit that's dear to my heart, but it's just not nearly all you'll want to see in France. Every French city has a lot to offer, but even just limiting oneself to a few cities is not really ideal for a trip to France. I mean, all around the country there are tons of cultural heritage sites, beautiful nature, and interesting towns and villages that are often not even that well known internationally. But Paris is a great place to start or end an amazing trip. And when you're in Paris, or anywhere else in France for that matter, just take any preconceptions that you might or might not have gotten by watching a show like Emily in Paris and try your hardest to forget them. I'm not saying that the show is good, bad, or anything else, but the reality that you'll find on the ground in France, well, I think it's a lot cooler. But there is another common mistake that's super easy to avoid, yet still happens all the time. Just like in your home country or anywhere else, it's important to stay alert when out and about, and this particularly applies to Paris. There are plenty of pickpockets operating in busy tourist areas of bigger French cities, and the Paris metro also has a bit of a reputation for having a lot of them. I've traveled to France dozens of times, and I've never had any issues at all. Nobody I know has had any issues either. But alright, you're watching this, you've probably got some travel experience, so I think you get the idea. But if you do have any more specific questions regarding safety in France or just want to share an experience, please feel free to drop a comment below. Another preconception that I've heard one too many times is that French people are snobby or even stuck up. I don't really know where this reputation comes from, but it's just not true at all. Maybe there are some snobby French people, but they're not the French people I know or even the French people I've had encounters with. And obviously it's always a mistake to categorize an entire country's population into one box. But at the same time, some generalizations are at least based on some version of fact. If someone told me that all people from the US always ask, "How are you?" every time they meet someone, that might not be 100% true, but it would be based on fact in my experience. But snobby French people? I don't even get why people think that, but it's a myth. French people are generally approachable, kind, and helpful. So just don't show up here expecting the French to be any different from you or me, and this really applies to any place you'll visit. But okay, you and I both know English, and the main language you'll encounter in France is French. And the French do tend to prefer to speak in their own language in France. Though honestly, there is a pretty good level of English spoken throughout the country, particularly by younger generations. But still, sometimes people won't know that much English or they'll prefer to keep their side of the conversation in French. And that brings up one other common mistake. When in France, you should not assume that everybody will want to speak English with you. Some people will be eager to speak English with you, while others will not. If you're just visiting France for a short vacation, learning a little bit of basic French will get you a long way. And I'd advise you not to show up to France without at least being able to say bonjour, merci, and s'il vous plaît. And we did talk a little bit about eating times here in France, but more generally, it's a pretty big mistake to not know when things are going to happen when you're in France. You'll likely hear someone say, c'est pas grave during your stay here in France, and this roughly translates to it's not really a big deal, or it's not a big deal. This same idea applies to the French concept of punctuality. It's generally normal to be a tiny bit late all across France. But in my experience, a little bit late can have different interpretations depending on the part of France that you're in. In the south of France, I generally find that being around 30 minutes late is totally normal. But in Paris, I'd say it's more like 10 or 15 minutes that's the norm. And whatever you do not plan too much on Sundays. I mean, there are certainly things to do on a Sunday in France, but many businesses will close their doors every Sunday and it's looked at as a day of rest. Local holidays are also pretty much the same as Sundays, meaning many businesses will be closed. Local festivities could be a nice addition to your trip, but also be aware that prices for hotels, flights, and more could be well above average. But just do a quick search for your travel dates and you'll know what you're getting into. If you don't do that search though, your trip could turn out to be much different than you'd planned. But if you're subscribed to my channel, I know you've got the information you need to plan a trip well to any country. And one thing that I always find drastically different compared to what I'm used to when visiting France is that it's usually considered taboo to talk about the price of things or money in general. One example that I've seen happen a few times, if you're in a tourist shop and something is way overpriced, it's really taken as quite rude to say something out loud about it. This may seem like an insignificant thing, but it can really be taken the wrong way in France. If you know someone really well, things may be different. But when talking about money and prices in France, if you think something really needs to be said, the best thing to do in my opinion is to ask people if they mind discussing it. But if you can, I'd just avoid discussing money in France unless it's absolutely necessary. And one other thing that is absolutely necessary for an enjoyable trip to France is knowing what it means to have good manners in France. A lot of things that are good manners in France are good manners elsewhere too. You want to keep doing the really obvious stuff like holding open the door for the person behind you or giving up your seat for an elderly person on the train. But one thing that you might not be used to is that greetings in France usually involve cheek kisses. The amount of kisses can also vary by region too. So if you're not sure how many to do, it's probably easiest just to ask. And in general, France is pretty formal from my view. It's considered important to be formal with people that you don't know well. In the French language, you actually have informal and formal ways of addressing people. But even if you aren't able to speak much French, it's always well received to address people as Madame or Monsieur. And that really covers the common mistakes that I've encountered on my many trips to France. And keeping them in mind will definitely help you have a better trip to this beautiful country. If you've got other tips or questions that you want to share, just drop them below in the comments. And make sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more travel videos. Au revoir!